They thought he was just another tired man waiting at the bus stop, slumped over with the weight of a long day. They didn't realize the mistake they were about to make. One wrong move was all it took to uncover the former Marine beneath the worn exterior. A man they never should have messed with. The bus stop bench creaked under David's weight as he sat, his frame slightly hunched yet oddly composed. The dim light from a faulty street lamp flickered above, casting erratic shadows over his face. Exhaustion etched lines into his dark skin, glistening faintly under the weak glow. It was nearing midnight, and Kansas City streets were unusually quiet for a Friday night. David's shoulders sagged beneath the weight of his heavy backpack, packed with tools from his day job as a mechanic. Tonight, he was coming off a grueling second shift cleaning office buildings. His body ached from the endless grind, his temples pulsing in sync with the fatigue coursing through him. All he wanted was to get home, sink into his threadbare recliner, and maybe, just maybe, steal a few hours of sleep before the relentless cycle began anew. The sharp laugh of a group of young men nearby broke through his thoughts. David shifted his gaze briefly toward them. There were 4 of them, no older than their mid-20s, dressed in oversized hoodies and loose jeans. Their loud, brash voices cut through the still night air like knives. "Yo, old man," one of them called out. David ignored the taunt, tightening his grip on his backpack. "What's the matter, you deaf?" Another voice chimed in, tinged with mockery. He didn't flinch, didn't react. His gaze remained fixed ahead, unwavering. Years of military training had instilled in him a discipline that couldn't be easily rattled, even in moments like this. But the voices persisted, growing sharper, more pointed. An empty soda can clattered onto the ground, bouncing to a stop just inches from David's steel-toe boots. The faint metallic echo rang in the silence. For a moment, his face remained unreadable, a mask of calm indifference. But inside, something stirred. A faint ember of vigilance sparked to life. It's always the loud ones, David thought, his instincts humming with quiet awareness. The ones who don't know when to quit. Experience had taught him that ignoring trouble sometimes only emboldened it. He'd been in situations like this before. Some people saw a man in faded clothes, carrying the weight of exhaustion and assumed vulnerability. What they didn't see was a Marine beneath. The soldier who had survived 2 tours overseas and spent years honing skills that had saved lives, including his own. Life after the Marines had been a different kind of battle. Returning to civilian life brought its own challenges, scarce job opportunities, mounting bills, and a world that rarely acknowledged the sacrifices made by veterans like him. David took whatever work he could find, often juggling multiple jobs to keep his head above water. Yet no matter how tough things got, he carried himself with quiet dignity. Tonight was no different. He wasn't dressed to intimidate, just a faded blue work shirt, scuffed jeans, and those reliable steel-toe boots. His calloused hands rested on his knees, a testament to years of hard, honest labor. But David was far from ordinary. Beneath the weariness lay a relentless spirit, a man forged by adversity. Though he had no desire for conflict tonight, he was prepared for it if it came. One of the young men stepped closer, his sneakers scraping against the concrete. "What? You too good to talk to us," he sneered, leaning into his bravado. David finally looked up, his eyes locking onto the man's with a calm, unshaken gaze. "I'm just waiting for my bus," he said, his voice low and even. The young man smirked, glancing back at his friends. "Hear that? Too busy for us. Must think he's better than us." Their laughter echoed down the empty street, a harsh sound that bounced off the surrounding buildings. But bravado has a way of spiraling into something darker. David felt the subtle shift in the air, the moment when mocking humor teeters on the edge of hostility. He sat motionless, his posture relaxed but his mind sharp. Every nerve in his body remained attuned, ready. They didn't know who they were dealing with. As the leader of the group stepped even closer, David made no sudden moves. But his muscles coiled beneath the surface, a dormant strength waiting for the inevitable spark. In the silence between the laughter, The tension crackled like a live wire. They thought they had the upper hand. They were wrong. David sidestepped with precision, his movements honed from years of training. The wild punch missed entirely, the young man stumbling forward slightly as his momentum carried him off balance. David didn't retaliate immediately. Instead, he held his ground, his hands at his sides, his stance unshaken. "You don't want this," David said, his voice calm but commanding, his eyes fixed on Baseball Cap, who was now glaring at him, fists clenched. The group went silent for a moment, the air thick with tension. The bravado that had fueled their taunts moments ago now faltered as they registered the difference between a fight and a mistake. David was no ordinary man, and even their bravado couldn't mask the uncertainty creeping in. "Get him!" one of the others shouted, breaking the silence and reigniting the group's aggression. Two of the men lunged toward David, emboldened by numbers. David moved quickly, his instincts taking over. He stepped back, letting the first attacker overcommit, and used his momentum to guide him past with a simple pivot. The second came in clumsily, arms swinging wildly. David deflected the strikes with precise movements, his arms moving like a shield. "Stop this now," David warned again, his tone sharper this time. But the warning fell on deaf ears. Baseball Cap lunged again, this time more desperate. David caught his arm mid-swing, twisting it just enough to immobilize without causing harm. He held him there, his grip firm but controlled. "Enough," David said, his voice low, almost a growl. The others hesitated, their bravado visibly draining. The leader, now restrained, squirmed in David's grip, his confidence replaced by panic. "Let me go," he shouted, but his voice cracked, betraying his fear. David released him with a push, sending him stumbling back into his friends. "Walk away," David said, his eyes scanning the group. "This is your last chance." For a moment, no one moved. The group stood frozen, the weight of David's presence pressing down on them like a tangible force. Then one of the younger men, the one who had stayed furthest back, muttered, "Come on, man. Let's just go." Baseball Cap looked at David, his chest heaving, and for a moment it seemed like he might try again. But David's steady gaze didn't waver, and something in it made the young man pause. Without another word, he turned, muttering under his breath, and the others followed. As they retreated down the street, David stood tall, his breathing steady, watching until they disappeared around a corner. The night grew quiet again, the hum of the street lamp the only sound. David exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly, and adjusted his backpack. He turned back to the bench, lowering himself onto it with the same deliberate control he had shown during the altercation. The bus's headlights appeared in the distance, growing brighter as it approached. David sat in silence, replaying the moment in his mind. He didn't feel victorious or triumphant. Instead, he felt a deep exhaustion, the kind that comes from having to prove yourself yet again, even when you shouldn't have to. The world he had fought to protect seemed to have little room for the peace he longed for. The bus pulled up, its brakes hissing as the doors swung open. David climbed aboard, nodding to the driver before finding a seat near the back. As the bus rumbled to life and rolled down the dark street, David leaned his head against the window, staring out into the night. For a moment, his reflection stared back at him, and he saw not just a tired man but a fighter, a survivor, and a protector. He closed his eyes, letting the motion of the bus lull him into a rare moment of stillness. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more battles to fight on the clock, in the world, and in his own mind. But for now, David allowed himself a brief moment of peace, knowing that while the fight hadn't been his choice, his response had reminded him of the strength that still burned within him. As David settled into his seat, the bus jolted forward, its engine humming softly in the quiet night. He leaned his head back against the window, the cool glass soothing the residual tension in his muscles. The scuffle replayed in his mind, not as a moment of triumph, but as a reminder of how close things had come to spiraling out of control. David stared out into the city streets as they passed. the fluorescent glow of streetlights casting fleeting shadows across his face. Kansas City had always been a mix of beauty and hardship, a place where dreams and struggles coexisted. Tonight had been no different. His thoughts drifted to the young men. They had reminded him of himself at their age, not the aggression, but the misplaced need to prove something. He'd been fortunate to find structure and purpose in the military, but not everyone was so lucky. Some wandered through life, searching for meaning in all the wrong places, finding trouble instead of answers. The bus stopped, and a few passengers climbed aboard. A young woman holding a sleeping child nodded at David as she passed. He returned the gesture, his expression softening. The simplicity of her quiet struggle was a sharp contrast to the chaos he'd just experienced. It reminded him of what truly mattered: resilience, kindness, and the unspoken connections that bound people together, even in their most trying moments. As the bus rolled on, David thought of his daughter, Emma. She was his anchor, the reason he kept pushing forward despite the endless grind. She deserved a father who could teach her strength without anger, compassion without weakness. He knew moments like tonight could either harden him or refine him. For Emma's sake, he chose the latter. The bus turned onto his street, the familiar landmarks pulling him back to the present. David pressed the button to signal his stop and gathered his bag. As the bus came to a halt, he stepped off, the cool night air wrapping around him like a second skin. Walking toward his apartment, he passed a neighbor sitting on their stoop, nodding in greeting. The faint sound of a radio playing blues music drifted through an open window. David reached his building and climbed the stairs, his boots echoing softly in the stairwell. Inside his modest apartment, the quiet was almost overwhelming. He dropped his bag by the door and headed to the kitchen. The fridge hummed as he pulled out a bottle of water, the cool liquid easing the dryness in his throat. He stood there for a moment, the weight of the night settling on his shoulders. After a while, David walked to his daughter's room. Peeking inside, he saw Emma sprawled across her bed, her small frame tangled in a mess of blankets. Her steady breathing filled the room, a gentle rhythm that seemed to erase the heaviness of the night. He stepped inside quietly, tucking the blanket around her and brushing a stray curl from her forehead. She stirred slightly but didn't wake, her face peaceful in the soft glow of her nightlight. David stood there for a moment longer, his heart swelling with a mix of love and determination. No matter how hard the world pushed, moments like this reminded him why he kept standing tall. Emma was his future, his reason to keep fighting for something better. As he turned to leave, David paused in the doorway. The words he'd spoken to those young men echoed in his mind. You don't want to find out. They hadn't just been a warning to them. They were a reminder to himself. Violence wasn't strength, and fear wasn't power. True strength lay in restraint, in the ability to rise above and walk away when it mattered most. He closed the door softly behind him, retreating to his own room. The bed creaked as he lowered himself onto it, his body heavy with fatigue. But as he closed his eyes, David felt something he hadn't felt all day, a quiet resolve. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own battles. But David was ready. For Emma, for himself, and for the world that still needed more people who chose compassion over chaos. He'd face whatever came his way. As David sat in the recliner, the quiet of his apartment wrapped around him like a heavy blanket. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the faint ticking of a clock on the wall were the only sounds. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath as he let the tension of the day slowly drain from his body. The weight of the encounter at the bus stop lingered, not as regret, but as a quiet meditation on the choices he'd made. David had long ago learned that life was less about the moments when you acted and more about the moments when you chose not to. It wasn't weakness to walk away. It was wisdom. In his younger days, he might not have handled tonight the same way. Back then, pride and anger were sharper, ready to slice through reason at the first provocation. The Marines had taught him discipline. Yes, but life after the uniform had taught him humility. Bills piling up, rejection letters from jobs that didn't care about his military service, and nights spent wondering if he'd ever find his footing again had shaped him more profoundly than any battle overseas. He thought of Emma again, her face the first thing to come to his mind whenever he felt like giving in to the weight of the world. She deserved a father who could teach her not only how to stand tall, but also when to step back. The world would challenge her in ways he couldn't protect her from, but he could show her through his actions what true strength looked like. David's thoughts wandered to the young men from earlier. He hoped that tonight's encounter might plant a seed of change in them. They hadn't seemed like bad kids, just lost, grasping for validation in a way that society often taught young men to do. If they carried anything from tonight with them, David hoped it was a realization that respect isn't taken. It's earned, often through restraint and understanding. Reaching for the remote, David turned on the small TV in the corner of the room. The familiar sound of late-night news filled the space, but his mind was only half listening. The anchor's voice droned on about another act of violence in the city, a grim reminder of how easily things could escalate when people chose pride over peace. The words echoed in David's head. Respect is a two-way street. He'd said it to himself 1,000 times over the years, repeating it like a mantra whenever life tested his resolve. Tonight, it had been his anchor, grounding him when he could have let frustration or exhaustion take the wheel. The clock ticked past midnight, and David finally pushed himself up from the recliner. He walked to the small kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and leaned against the counter. The cool tile beneath his bare feet was grounding, a tactile reminder of where he was and how far he'd come. Tomorrow would bring another long day of work, another battle with fatigue and the grind of everyday life. But David felt ready for it. He'd face it the way he always did, with quiet determination and the knowledge that the battles worth fighting were rarely the loudest ones. As he rinsed the glass and set it in the sink, David glanced out the window. The city lights twinkled in the distance, a reminder of the countless lives moving through their own struggles and triumphs. Somewhere out there, those young men were likely still processing the night in their own way. He could only hope they'd find their own lessons in what had transpired. Returning to his bedroom, David paused by Emma's door. He opened it quietly, peeking in once more to see her sleeping soundly. The sight brought a small smile to his face, a moment of peace that made the weight of the day seem lighter. As he lay down in his own bed, David felt a sense of closure. The night had tested him, but it hadn't defined him. Tomorrow, he would rise again, ready to face whatever the world threw his way. And with each step forward, he carried the same quiet resolve. Strength wasn't about the battles you fought, but the ones you chose to walk away from.